Okay. For people who are doing this course for credit, their certificates are back there. You can pick them up and turn them into me before you go. We have notes from previous classes available, I think, back there, or we might have run out of those. So if people haven't been here for other classes and want to see something of what we did and so on, you're welcome to take those notes. There's some in the second last table back there. The lady there is handling those for me. She will. Anyone who missed the first couple classes can get those. Well, the overall title of this whole series I'm doing is called The Spiritual Quest. And those words are carefully chosen. That word quest is supposed to give a little excitement to the whole thing, a sense of adventure. That in life, that there's not just a matter of the tightrope, as I often say, that we're always worried we're going to fall off, commit a mortal sin, and mess everything up, but that we try to see life as an adventure, as a searching out, that there's an excitement about it, a certain enjoyment in just plain going through the things of life. There's a certain way in which that gets distorted in our minds, I think, that it's always worrying about the finish line, as someone said in a recent lecture, that we're too worried about the finish line, how it's going to turn out, and not able to get enough into the excitement of the game itself. I always think of Jack Nicklaus when I talk like that, the golfer, and the fact that Nicklaus, the greatest thing is to be going down the 18th fairway with a chance to win the tournament. It's not, the greatest thing isn't to be sitting in there putting the green coat on as the Masters champ, but for him the real excitement was in the action, in the doing. And I think that's an important kind of idea. The spiritual life is a quest, an exciting quest, an adventure. And what we've got to learn, I think, is somehow to appreciate the adventure. Not just, well, I'll put up with all this until I can get to heaven someday, or that all that we're going through now is just like basket weaving with no inner meaning, but the notion that what we are going through now is worthwhile, that our freedom is really our ability to make ourselves to be what we will be forever, that all of the little choices, the decisions each day, am I going to exercise today or not? That's significant. Am I going to eat too much of this meal or not? It's significant. It's all of it is making us to be what we will be forever. It's right within all of that that the spiritual life is taking place, not apart from it. So that we're trying to get away, in this course at least, from this idea of that spiritual life is just a separate realm, a region of life, and it's just got to do with getting to some place someday that we call heaven. Spiritual life is learning how to live well now. Irenaeus, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. We're trying to learn how to live this existence as best we can, to live each moment. I mean, how often do I meet people who are in terrible struggles in life, and when you talk to them about how they're making it, how are they surviving it, it is one day at a time, or maybe half a day at a time, or maybe just this hour. If I can just live this hour well, then we'll deal with the next hour later on. And I think that a lot of people find that wisdom, and it really is to be commended. That's the word quest. Adventure, excitement, growth, development, utilizing our potential. That's part of what we are trying to discern here and look at. The other side of it is spiritual quest, so that it is not simply a quest to move ahead in the socioeconomic ladder, not simply a quest to develop our intelligence or our earning power or anything like that. Spiritual quest indicates that there's a depth dimension to all of this. There's always more than meets the eye. There's a seriousness about it. There's got to be a commitment involved in accomplishing these things. Spiritual is a word that breaks open all the reductionisms. Reductionisms try to reduce life, try to make it just something you can quantify or count, or spiritual keeps saying, no, it's always bigger than we think. There's always a greater depth than we've plumbed now. There's always more to it than we ever expected. There's always surprises involved in this journey. There's new things that can happen. So those two words together try to create a mood or a feeling around all of this. The spiritual quest is an exciting adventure to uncover the real depths that are always around us, to uncover the deep potential that we've never tapped inside of ourselves. It is an attempt to find new ways of responding to the call of God. It's getting excited and turned on by the Christian life, about dedication to Christ, about what the gospel's all about. Now, we've been trying to parse that out, look at various aspects of it as we've gone along here. Well, we're talking about the search itself, and then we talk about the search for our true self. So we tried to do last week, try to find out who we are, where we fit, what we are all about, what's the deepest truth about us, and we try to talk about us as oriented to mystery. And now tonight we move to the third in this series of searches, quests. Tonight we want to talk about the search for God. Now, I debated long and hard about how to go about this, and I've decided to do some heavy intellectual work here at the beginning. A necessary kind of thing. I know it's necessary, but it's good to stretch the mind anyway and get in touch with some. So I want to begin the first of my three sections of my presentation tonight with the question. First of all, we're talking about the search for God. Well, what is it we're looking for? And we might never find it if we're not looking for the right thing. What are we looking for when we say we're in a search for God? In other words, what does that word God itself mean to us? You know, and I'm thinking, it always flashes in my mind the Russian cosmonauts. They were looking for God when they first went up. They looked all throughout the heavens. They searched all up there with their spaceship and so on. And they came back and reported he wasn't there. They didn't find him. There is no God. Their Marxist ideology was right. There is no God. Well, we sort of laugh at that, don't we? I wonder why we laugh at it. Well, partly because they weren't doing it right, or they weren't looking in the right way. Isn't that? Or well, why do you think it's funny in a way? Well, there's something wrong with what they were doing, right? They said they're searching for God, but they didn't find him. But we think, well, they didn't go about it right. They're looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for some object up there in the sky, like a sun or a star or a planet or something. And they didn't find a God like that. Now that puts us on alert to the fact that the word God is indeed questionable. That is, not everybody understands what you mean by that word right away. And this is really a modern phenomenon. If you go back to the 13th century when the great theologian Thomas Aquinas did his work, when he argued and proved to people that there was a God, he went through his argument. He said, well, everything has a cause, and therefore you have to have a first cause. And the first cause is what we all mean by God. He had 5 proofs like that, and each one concluded with the same thing. That's what we all mean by God. He assumed everyone had a common knowledge of that, and I think his assumption was correct. But what has happened in our own time, the 20th century, is that very word God has become a problem now, because we understand that everyone doesn't know what they mean by that word. In fact, one has to be leery of using it. No, I try to not just use that word too easily, because if I use the word God in a group, there's some people in the group who think I'm talking about a man who's up in the sky who helps people who are in trouble if they say enough prayers. Oh, and they're looking for a God like that, just like the Russian cosmonauts, and when they say a whole bunch of prayers and nothing good happens, they figure, well, he isn't there, just like the cosmonauts did. So there's some people, when I'm talking like that, and I say, well, let's search for God, I mean, they don't even show up tonight, because they know that would just make them feel bad. If they came and listened to all that talk about God, it would wrench their guts in one way or another. It would make them feel bad. It might make them feel guilty, for example. It might make them feel like they were going to go to hell someday and get burned up forever. So they boycott the lecture tonight. For their mental health. They can't deal with that. So, you see, if I just throw out the word, what is it we're looking for, about a search for God, well, I've already probably made a mistake in the title of the lecture. I've even gotten started, and I've already messed up people's minds. Let's search for God. We could probably go through the room here and get 100 different ideas of what that is we're looking for. So, we have to come to grips, it seems to me, with right away the problem character of all of that. Now, if I try to respond to that now, and to try to get a hold of what it is that we're searching for, are we going to say that in a positive kind of way? Well, the first thing that my mentor, Karl Rahner, who is our guru throughout this course, our guide, spiritual master, Rahner says that, well, maybe that's not so bad that word is so vague to people. Maybe that's good. If we started talking about let's search for the Almighty Father, well, then that might cause us even more troubles, because that's very defined and clear. We know what fathers are. We've got a very clear idea of that. But the word God is much more open-ended than that, much vaguer, means many different things to people. And so Rahner says, why not? Well, maybe it's okay to talk about this word God, because it is vague, because everyone's got sort of a different idea. Then we could fill it out and get a better idea of it, and try to adjust our notion of what God is all about. So let's think positively. Rahner's got a marvelous way of doing that. Looks at most any reality, and he can see something good in what is going on there. That despite his sort of, as I've described it, wintry piety, or his own sober realism, or that sort of stark look he gives you, and his penetrating eyes. You see his picture doesn't look like he's a great, joyful optimist, and yet he has this interesting ability to see good in most any kind of situation. So the fact that the word God is problematical, as we say, it's a questionable word, that's okay, because now we can talk about it more openly. The other thing that Rahner says is, try to think what would happen if the word God would disappear, much as Karl Marx thought it would. And Marx thought that if we could get to the classless society, then the very word God would appear. You wouldn't need it. In fact, you wouldn't need the word atheist anymore, because it would just all disappear. You wouldn't have to talk about theism versus atheism. That question wouldn't even arise anymore. And Rahner's response to that is that if the word God ever disappeared, then we would revert to the level of a sophisticated animal. Well, that's an interesting kind of thing to ponder. If the word God disappeared, didn't have that word anymore, weren't able to deal with the reality that word refers to, we would no longer be human. We'd no longer be what we are, people who can abstract and think and ask about who we are and where we're going and what life is all about and where this marvelous journey is taking us. Wouldn't be able to ask those questions. If the word God was taken away, we wouldn't be able to ask the comprehensive question. That is, what's it all about? Where do I fit? What's the purpose of it? We wouldn't be able to call all of reality into question and ask ourselves, does this whole process make sense or is it absurd? For honor, the Word God keeps open the question. It keeps us from just vegetating. Keeps us from just zeroing in on ourselves and becoming egocentric. It keeps us really from just sitting there staring at the TV. That's what the Word God does. The Word God opens up the question. So somebody came in tonight and they said, what's this question here? Search for God. What? Well, a minor question. What is this? They said to me, let's go for the biggie. Well, you don't get a bigger question than that. That's the great question. That is, the search for God is a search for what's it all about. Where do we fit? Who are we? And so on. Now, when we begin to ask that question, then we say, well, why do we laugh about the Russian cosmonauts? Well, for one reason, maybe, because they seem to be talking about God as though he were material, or as though she were a particular object someplace. And that we instinctively think is wrong. Augustine had that problem when he was developing in his own thought. He had trouble imagining anything that wasn't material, that wasn't physical. But it becomes more subtle than that, because I think even people who laugh at the cosmonauts often fall back into sort of a childish notion of God, as though God is one being among a bunch of beings. Like we got rocks and trees and animals and people and God. He's one among many. He's bigger and better and more powerful and so on, but he's one among many of the things or persons that are running around this cosmos of ours. And so if one thinks that way, then you think, well, then the next question is, well, where is he? Is he up or down or here or there? Let's go look for him. That is what I would call a sort of unsophisticated notion of who God might be. And that forces us in the modern world to sort of rethink this and to come up with other ways of speaking about what it is we're searching for. Two of my own favorite words that are borrowed from Rahner are these, that we're looking for not a being, but the source of all being. We're not looking for an object, but for the goal of all of our striving, that towards which we're moving into unity. So those two words, source and goal, become another way of beginning to think about God, ways that are good to break us out of the idea that God is a big father up in the sky. Or a kindly grandfather who's floating around up there. What this kind of language does is make sure that we don't narrow God. God becomes now bigger than that, more all-encompassing than that. Now, to take you a next step in this tough intellectual journey, I've lost a few people already. What do I do to get them back? As the teachers present, what do I do now? Lost a few already. I get them back. Well, let's go back to ourselves. That's right. Because that's inherently interesting. You can wake up now. We're going to talk about us. See, because instead of talking about God, well, because we'll never figure out who God is apart from looking at ourselves. Apart from looking at our own operations, our own functioning, what we do, how we are, how we live. That's where we ought to go back to. So what we end up looking at ourselves and we find sort of a dynamism in our hearts. a drive. We find something that's propelling us forward. Strange, mysterious forces that keep us learning and keep us striving and wanting more experience and wanting more love, as we've talked about it before. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, where does that come from? What is the source of that dynamism, that drive, that strange, infinite questing that's built into our soul? What's the source of the question mark that's right here? Well, that's what we might mean by the word God. The word God points to that source that we don't control but controls us. That source that energizes us, gives us power, makes us be dynamic, questing people. That's one way of thinking of what God is. God is the source of everything we are, our being, our strength, our energy, our ideas, anything good we've ever done, any love we've ever given. God's the source of that, the origin of it. It comes from Him. And then to move to the imagery that is in the beautiful quote. I don't expect you to read it now, but don't miss reading the quote from Ronner before you go to bed tonight. I think it's a marvelous poetic vision of this other side of what God's all about. Maybe I should look at that here. Yeah. See, he says, you know, where are we going? We're on a journey, but where does the journey lead? Do we run the course only to lose the way in the end? No. We know very well that God is the goal of our pilgrimage. That becomes His image. Who is God? God's the goal of the journey. It's the one we're going towards. The way to Him seems to us all too far and all too hard. And what we ourselves mean when we say God is incomprehensible. We don't know exactly what that word means. Then he tries, ground of all reality, sea to which all the brooks of our yearning make their way, nameless beyond, behind all that is familiar to us, infinite enigma that conceals all other enigmas in itself. Well, here we have immensity in purest simplicity. So all these images that Ronner gives us for the goal, that towards which we're striving, not of being, not an aspect of life, not just an energy force, but the personal goal that allures us, draws us into the future and promises us one day that the longings of the heart, the dynamism that's inside of us and that bugs us and drives us and sometimes eats us up and makes us feel uncomfortable, gives us trouble, that dynamism one day will find its rest, its peace, its fulfillment. So, this is what God is for honor, source and goal. God has promised in His Word that He lets Himself to be found by those who seek Him. In grace He wills not merely the one who is always a little farther beyond, but rather to be that one who really can be found, eye to eye, heart to heart, by that small creature with the eternal heart that we call the human being. So, that is Ronner's poetic way of trying to get us in touch with what this another way of thinking of God, source, and especially as he tries to go out there as goal. Now, what seems crucial if we move in that direction is to maintain the notion that the source and the goal is personal. One of the phrases in there was the ground of being. That's the language used by Paul Tillich, and people often make fun of that. If you take the image of God as being ultimate concern and ground of being, that's his notions. I don't know what that is, if that means much to anybody. I mean, but you can tell it's sort of abstract. Well, the jokes people make are, it's time to pray, and now we're going to kneel down and pray to the ground of being. You know, dear ultimate concern, please help me. Well, it sounds a little strange, you know. And the problem with all of that, it's the problem with much of this language, is that it sounds less than personal. It almost sounds that what we're looking for is an energy force. What is that in the movie? The force. Isn't that it in the movies? The force. And it's almost what we're looking for is the force. Well, what we need to do is to make sure that we see the force, the power, the source, the goal, in at least personal terms. In other words, what we're looking for can't be less than us. It can't be like an electric current. Whatever it is they're looking for, it's got to have what we've got: intelligence, will, love, all the things that make us be above animal existence. So whenever we're trying to say what we're looking for, it's got to keep the love dimension in there. That's why my own favorite phrase then, or image for God, becomes the gracious mystery. The word gracious carries that, doesn't it? I mean, it's a beautiful word to me. Gracious mystery. It brings to mind the notion of a God who cares, who's concerned, who loves us, who comes near, enters into personal relationships with us. A God you could pray to, talk to, ask for help, praise that God, thank Him for what's going on. Honor and glory to this God. The gracious mystery is one that's personal, that we can enter into dialogue with. So what is it, therefore, that we're looking for? That becomes important. If we're looking for a God who just makes us feel good whenever we pray, we're not going to find a consistent God like that. We might end up as atheists. We're looking for a God who helps us, something good to happen. We're going to get a new car, even though we don't have enough money because we say our prayers. Then we're going to be disappointed. That isn't going to happen. No, if we're looking for some being that we can talk to sometime, maybe now and then get an answer, we're probably off the track. What Ronner calls on us is to be more sophisticated about it, to be more adult, not to put aside the childlike trust. That's important. Childlike trust is really good. I mean, we have to have that, to let go, surrender to this God. But in our mind, to come to a more enlightened notion. I like to call it an enlightened simplicity. So when we're little, we do trust God, and that's good. Well, if we grew up in the right family, I should say, in the right surroundings, and everything is right, that would be good. We'd say we trust God. It's like we trust our mothers to care for us, or our fathers. No, but as we go along, we almost have to move through a critical phase where we begin to question that. Why is there so much suffering in the world? Why don't people get what they want? Why is it so hard? Why is this life such a vale of tears? It almost seems as though to reach adulthood you have to go through that kind of critical phase. But we do it to get to what I would call an enlightened simplicity, what Paul Ricoeur called a second naivete, a second childlike attitude where we trust God, but now we do it in a deeper and more sophisticated way, an enlightened simplicity. Now we understand that the great God can't be confined in our categories, that the great God is incomprehensible, inexhaustible. We can't know exactly what He is. And we're not searching for a particular being. We're trying to get in touch with the source of all that we are. We're trying to be dedicated to the goal of our strivings, the one, the gracious mystery that draws near to us. That perhaps begins to help us to see in a little deeper way what it is that we might be looking for when we undertake this search for God. Well, I'm going to pause there, and why don't we spend a couple minutes. I'd invite you to turn to the person next to you and Well, as you can see in the quote even from Ronner, he uses that very language at the end of his quote, that we will see God face to face, that he won't just be remote from us. That, of course, as all of our language about God is metaphorical, or as we say, analogical. That is, all the things we say about God are derived from our own human experience. And we think it says something true about God, but it doesn't apply to God in a straightforward, literal way. Example, we say that God is our Father, that God is a good Father. And yet, in most ways, that God isn't. He's not male to begin with. He doesn't have any children. No, he doesn't have the characteristics that we associate with being a father, and yet we say that about God. But what does that mean? Well, it means something about God, that he shows the kind of care and concern that a good father does, only more so, only greater somehow. And you could take that about every word we use about God. It's all symbolic. All the imagery we have, nothing relates just one-to-one. So if I look at this man and I say, he's a father, we know what that means. He's like other fathers. He has children. He's produced children. He's a member of the male sex. It's clear to us. But when we say God is a father, he's more unlike fathers than like them. And you can take any word that you want to talk about that way, or any imagery. Therefore, when you say, you raise the question, well, do you see God face to face? Or are we walking the streets of the heavenly Jerusalem? Or are we at the banquet with the Lamb when we're in heaven? Well, if you think of that just literally, then I would have to say no. No, but it's the same way with the word father. Does that mean God isn't a father because he doesn't have any children? Or isn't male? No, we can still say that accurately and truly, and we've always said it throughout Christian history. Can we say that when we die, we'll be at the heavenly banquet in the city of Jerusalem in union with the Lamb, see God face to face? Yes. We can say that, but an enlightened simplicity, a trusting person who has gone through their critical phase and thought through this, will know that the language is symbolic and poetic and points to a reality that's always greater than we can ever imagine. As Paul says, eye has not seen, nor has it even entered in the heart of man what God has prepared for us. It's all bigger than that. St. Thomas once said that the most important thing, Aquinas that is, the most important thing you could know about God is that you don't know him. And that became, crucial. And the most important thing of all is to know that. That's not a throwaway line after you think you're so bright and intelligent and grown up or whatever, then to say, well, there's some things I don't know. No, Aquinas said the most important thing is to know that. Ronner says the same thing. The most important thing is, remember, is that God is inexhaustible, incomprehensible. One of his major theses that he developed, and sounds strange to people, when I heard his lecture in Chicago in 1974, the 70th of the death of Thomas Aquinas, which was in 1274, so they had a big celebration at the University of Chicago. Catholic schools around the country didn't do that much, but that secular university did. Had this marvelous thing. They brought Uncle Carl in from Germany and so on. I never forget that occasion. In this big Rockefeller chapel there at the University of Chicago, we're sitting there, and they introduce Ronner, and he gets up, mounts this big thing, stands there, gives no word of introduction, gives nothing. He begins reading his talk in German. Fortunately, I had just seen a copy of that before that and had some perception of what he was talking about. And I looked around at people, and everybody said, you know, people had driven for hundreds of miles to be there, and here he is in a chapel full of people. Well, after Ronner read the first paragraph, he just turned around and walked down, sat down. Some other guy went up and read the rest of it in English translation while Carl took out his rosary, fingered it, and fell asleep. During his own lecture. I talked to one time. He says he understood enough of what Bill Dyke he thought was his best translator. Carl told me, he said, well, he knows enough English to know if Dyke was making any mistakes or not. The top title of that lecture was, a little obscure, but stay with me, that even in the beatific vision, according to the thought of Thomas Aquinas, God remains incomprehensible. What does that mean? Even when you get to heaven, God remains mystery. You don't get there and see him like face to face and say, aha, now I know who you are, you know. Like I got it all psyched now. You know, that's the real reason for his positive understanding of the afterlife as not being sitting in a rocking chair and just resting, but of life, of growth, because God would always be bigger than we could comprehend. The reason we would always grow in the next life and develop and have excitement about it and so on, precisely because God would always be mysterious to us. So Thomas Aquinas said, even in the beatific vision, even when you get to heaven, God will be incomprehensible. Thus, in other words, the poetic language is beautiful, and it tells us something true. That we're imaging something that's beyond us. What it's really telling us in other kind of language is that when we pass through death, we come to fulfillment. We come to a better, richer life. We don't know what it's like. We don't know how to describe it. It's not in our same time-space dimension. But our fundamental belief is we move into a community of love. We move into a place where the deepest longings of our heart are finally satisfied. The imagery points. All religious language is like this. If you say Mary was assumed into heaven, and you think of Virgin Mary like in a rocket, there she goes, you know. Well, I mean, that's all right when you're in the first grade, but after a while, I mean, that doesn't make sense. I mean, your next question is, how high did she have to go or something? It doesn't. So what you learn is, by that, and I don't mean to shock anybody or hurt anybody or their faith or anything, but if you just think about that, does that mean? Well, the doctrine of the Assumption is silly. Forget it. Don't talk about it. No. It's like every other bit of religious language. It's metaphorical. It's symbolic. It points to a deeper reality. It means that Mary has reached her fulfillment. She's gotten to where she's supposed to be and what she's supposed to be and how she's supposed to be forever. So we don't throw it out. We remember all religious language, all doctrines, all creeds, all liturgies. Everything we say about God is so limited and partial because God is inexhaustible. He's bigger than we are. It does? It's the first time that ever happened. Yeah, right. That's right. So the cosmonauts might well have been looking for that chariot, you know? That's right. Symbolic language. Always, all the Bible, all the doctrines, all the creeds. Until you get that, you're always in danger then of misreading it in an infantile way, more childish way, and then not being able to get the really childlike, trusting response we want to get to, that's based on a critical thinking about it. Perhaps, what do we do now? Yes, Kathy, go ahead. Well, I think that Ronner would differ from Aquinas in that, in being more open to the idea of growth, and it would be gradual. I don't think it does. That's a sticky question and a very good spin-off, but I don't think so. In Christian understanding, I don't see any room for reincarnation. Although Ronner says in the Foundations of Christian Faith, all of you who are up with me so far on page 100 or whatever it is, may have run into it already, but that it makes sense that the Buddhist notion of reincarnation is very much like our notion of purgatory. It's got the same function. That is, it realizes two things. One, that when we die, we're not perfect. We don't have it together. And two, that in heaven we're in a state of happiness and peace and repose. And how do you get from there to there? From the Buddhists, it is you keep coming back. And for Christians, it means that, I think, God's love purifies us when we die and brings us into His presence. Not a presence that would comprehend Him, that would exhaust God, but would be a loving union. I don't think there's room for reincarnation in Christian thought. Origen, one of the early Christian fathers, did dabble with that idea in a little bit, but I don't think that really holds water. Generally, it's not good enough. I'm thinking of the... Somebody said good. You're against reincarnation? Well, it doesn't fit with our whole Christian understanding thing, I don't think. Not of the individual life that we have. Christ the same way preceding us. Not coming back again, but reaching its fulfillment. I think it's built into the whole Christian understanding. That we remain ourselves. We have an identity. I'm thinking we've been at this for a while. What do we do? Take a break or what? I think we better take a little break before I launch into the next section. There's 3 sections. Yeah, let's take a little break. A couple minutes. I was asked questions about reincarnation and so on. I guess we were talking about that, about upon our death, where we go, and my answer is that, well, that's probably the wrong question. Where are we after we die? The right question, perhaps, is what is our condition that time? Are we happy or not? Are we ourselves or not? Are we conscious or not? Then I was asked the question about, if God is the incomprehensible mystery, then why are we sitting here talking about it? And that's very good. That really partakes to number 3 in my lecture here, part 3, which I'm not sure I'm going to get to here the rate I'm going. But what that does say, that's a very important remark to me, it does say that a caution is needed, especially on the part of theologians, and especially on the part of people who pray, that we realize the limitations of what we're doing. To say that God is incomprehensible doesn't mean that we don't know anything about God. We know that you can call God Abba, because Jesus did. We know that God is faithful. We know that God is loving. We know all kinds of things about God. We don't know everything about Him. We don't comprehend Him. We don't exhaust Him. But we know important things that help us. So if we sit around and talk and we all appreciate a little more that we're loved by God, then we're going to be better off. So theology has a secondary role, but an important one. It helps us, it also, to answer your question another way, that is, another reason for talking like that is, suppose we got somebody in the room here whose just critical intelligence is just waking up on this question, and they're having trouble saying, geez, how can there be a God when my prayers don't get answered? Then to be able to talk like this and sort it out might help them to maintain their faith in the midst of these difficulties here. Well, anyway, theology is a secondary thing, and always has to remember the importance of silence before God. Third part. Okay, second part of this rather lengthy lecture. And this has to do now with our, not about who we're looking for, but about our images of God. Now, I'll start out with the story of a particular Protestant clergyman who was having extreme difficulty in functioning as a clergyman because he was feeling so negative about God. He had to get up in the pulpit and talk about a God who was loving and so on, but he didn't feel that way in his heart. He had to... only doing that. As a matter of fact, it seemed to him that perhaps he was going to have to get out of the whole clergy business, which he in some ways liked. Now, in talking with him and trying to get at the root of the problem, I find out that a whole lot of his difficulty goes back to his family life again. That is, he had a horrible relationship with his father. His father was an ogre of the first magnitude. He was one of these abused children as a youngster. His father seldom ever complimented him or did anything good for him. And so when this clergyman got into church and had to start praying, Father in heaven, all he could think of was this man who had treated him so badly. When he looked at this image of God for him, God was an ogre. He was just like his father. You couldn't trust him. He didn't compliment you. He didn't send anything good your way. In fact, he was just waiting for you to mess up, and then you would get smashed in one way or another. He couldn't help it. That was in his guts. That was his emotional reaction to reading in the Bible about Abba, Father, about the prayers he had to say, and so on. And here he's at almost a total impasse in this whole thing. Now, I'll return to him in a minute, but what I want to point out again is that the problem is fairly common. That is, that we have a lot of people with negative images of God. It grows largely out of family experience and early religious experience. I dealt with many people over the years who have what we call scrupulosity. That is, they are excessively worried about sin. They think almost everything they do is a sin. And when I talk with those people, you will almost always come up with scary stories from their childhood. When they made their first communion, someone told them that if they chewed the host, they would their tongue would turn black or something, or that if they were out of line, they would God would punish them in some way. And maybe their mothers told them that. If you don't shape up, God will take care of you. And so almost always with people who have scrupulosity, my limited experience, well, I know how limited it was because I talked to an awful lot of scrupulous people, and that is that there's something scary about their relationship with God. They are afraid of God. That's why they got to do all these things just right, do every detail just right, go through every task, and maybe repeat it over and over. It's like Martin Luther. when he had to say his office, and he would just go over and over it so that he could make sure that God was on his side. Martin Luther's a good example now. I mean, we just had Reformation Sunday going to Lutheran churches and talking about this. In fact, I have radio programs now that no doubt everyone listens to are on Luther right now and the guilt thing. But Luther had a stern father, and his father used to use corporal punishment. I don't know if we'd say abused child these days or not, but he had this stern imagery, and therefore his whole bit was he had to prove himself vis-a-vis this God. Do everything just right so God would not jump on him, punish him, send him to hell. Well, people with scrupulosity often have this negative image of God. But even apart from that, apart from people who are suffering from that kind of thing, we have many people with a poor self-image that also goes along with that. Uncle Carl once said that you could look at your image of God and your image of yourself, and they would be exactly parallel. In other words, if you would tell me enough about your image of God, who God is, you describe it carefully, clearly, vividly to me, I would end up knowing what you think about yourself. Rahner thought that those two things corresponded almost exactly. And I guess in my own counseling experience, I tend to think that is true. Our personalities, our estimation of ourselves, our sense of who we are corresponds tightly with who God is for us. They go together. And if people have this problem, they're going to have to work on both of the things. The image of God and the self-image are going to have to improve somehow together or in sync so that a healthier life can be lived. Negative images of God are a great predictor of not doing well in life. Even our friend Andrew Greeley writes, who is an excellent sociologist when he stays in his field, excellent writer, and he says that it is a great predictor of marital adjustment. Great predictor of ability to cope with life. Great predictor of how involved one is in trying to create a better world. Interesting. In other words, when you're talking image of God, we're not talking some abstract theological theory that you can just slough off and say, so what, or that's nice, or leave that to the people in the ivory towers. When we're talking image of God, we're talking about us. We're talking about our ability to relate to other people, our ability to do well in life, our ability to be devoted and committed people, tied up tightly with who God is for us. Now, to return to the example, what kind of advice did I give to the clergyman? How did we go about trying to solve this problem? Well, what I did was talk more with him about other experiences in his life, and I ended up finding out that indeed he had a very positive relationship with his mother. His mother was a good, warm, caring person. He loved his mother, got along well with her, hated his father, loved his mother. Warm, tender images around his mother. Clue to the way to go. Right? His really only hope is to build his notion of God around his relationship with his mother. To make some sort of shift so that God for him is the maternal one. So that in his gut, that's how he begins to feel about God and to pray to God out of that positive experience that he had with his mother. You see, what's behind both my presentations so far is that God is not apart from our experience. God is the condition for our whole experience. God's the backdrop against which we do everything. God, our whole notion of God is tied up with us. The experience of self is the experience of God. You don't step back from who you are, become an objective observer and say, well, what do I think about God? You can't be a neutral, objective observer. What we are people who live and love and fail and so on, have relationships with people, and out of that grows our image of God. Therefore, the clergyman had to concentrate on that. Now, my suggested therapy was the one I use often, that is an imaginative therapy. That is, what he needed to do was to spend time each day going back over positive experiences with his mother, recall them vividly, keep them in mind, be able to put himself into the scene to feel how warm it was, what the sights and smells and sounds were, and out of that experience to build his prayer to God. That is, he had to think of God finally as like his mother, only more so. He had to think of God as having the warmth, the tenderness of his mother, only in a greater degree. And he had to build his prayer out of that experience. I wanted him to pray while he was imagining that, in that comforting position with his mother. Thank you, great Mother God. That is to get the turnaround, to get the emotional switch inside. The other kind of thing that we needed to do in this case was for him to go back and reread the Scriptures for all of the maternal imagery of God. Spirit hovering over the waters, the God who is nourishing. Bible text that says, even if the mother forgets her child, I will never forget you. To build up a whole repertoire of images and text and Bible stories. Jesus, I will gather you as the mother hen gathers the chicks. To get that kind of imagery in place of his excessively rigid paternal imagery of God. So he needs to do two kinds of things. He has to put himself into the maternal scene and then relate that to what God, Bible, Jesus teaching is all about. Thus trying to reverse the whole thing. Now, can we attempt to generalize all of that? Well, one thing we can do is to turn it around positively, and again what Greeley tells us is that warm, positive images of God, Christ, Mary, and the afterlife, we're concentrating on God, are the great positive predictors of being able to cope well with life, of being able to relate, adjust, do good, be devout, be committed to justice, and so on. So what it suggests to us is that we have to try to create a climate for people. Those of us who are in the church, as leaders in the church, one of the things we have to do, in other words, is create a climate at Mass, for example, where warm images of God come across. What Greeley found out is that the homilies at Mass are very important. We went through a phase that the priest said, well, Tom, no one listens to him anyway, why bother, you know? But what Greeley found is that they are extremely important, but not in the way we thought. They're not important from the content so much as the mood that's created. And the key question is the resulting mood warm, inviting, tender, or is it negative and repressive? So what we got to do if we are having poor self-image is get to liturgies that are warm and inviting and comforting. Get into a community where the language and talk is positive, upbeat. All of the religious symbolism that is around gives that positive, warm feeling to it. What that means for us personally is that we would have to try to uncover the warm images in the Scriptures and try to make them our own. I do the same thing with people who are going through anxiety attacks and so on, that to try to get into thinking or establishing a repertoire of images and Bible stories that one can go to, draw on, in order to lift oneself out of the depressions or the down periods. So, one thing that we would want to get out of this, the importance of the positive imaging. Now, here's whether it is a male-female thing. I mean, so what are you going to do with somebody who's got both parents were ogres, grew up in a tough family situation, both harsh, repressive people? What do you end up doing then? Again, what I would try to do is to build the image of God around positive experiences in life. Well, and sometimes on retreats, I will have people do this kind of exercise, to try to come up to think of a positive encounter they've had with another human being. Something that's significant. I don't mean passing someone saying hi, but significant encounter. Then what I get people to do is to try to describe it vividly. To try to remember everything about it. How one felt and how one reacted and so on. Then, the next step in this whole exercise is to see where there would be mystery present. That is something that one doesn't really, can't get a hold of, can't completely grasp, can't just exhaust in any way. You know, where was the mystery aspect of this encounter with this other person? And then, what I would ask them to do is to try to image that mystery. I mean, how would you describe it? What image do you have of that mysterious dimension that was at work in that experience? And final step, what I'd ask the person to do is tell a Bible story that fits around that image and that experience. Tell a Bible story that best captures or is like that experience you just had. It's the same thing I try to do with the minister. I'm trying to get hold, and we should all do this at some time or another. My own story, I think some people have heard me say this, I'll repeat it anyway. And I'm thinking of an encounter that way. My mother and father were going to Florida, I think, on a trip, and my mother said to me, "You talk to your father because he doesn't drive very well anymore, and he doesn't pay attention to the road, and when he talks to me like this, he doesn't watch where he's going. So I'm scared to death to drive with him. You know, drive all the way to Florida, a nervous wreck." So she says to me, "Well, talk to your father and tell him to pay attention on the road and to drive right." So I said, "Right. That's what I'll do." Of course. So I waited for my chance to say this. I approached it rather directly. I said, "Dad, you know, sometimes you don't drive very well anymore. You know, you don't pay attention to the road. You know, you're like all over. You don't watch or anything." He looks at me and he says, "What? You're telling me how to drive? You're the one who gets picked up all the time. You're the one that drives like a crazy man. I know what I'm doing. Besides, your mother put you up to that, didn't she?" And he goes on like this, and the next thing, just like that, he put his arm around my shoulder and he says, "Now, what we got to do is start planning for our fishing trip that's coming up. Now, we got to get on with this." Just like that. I tell you that very personal story. You now know a whole lot about my image of God. More than I could ever tell you in words. Out of that story. You know, I don't know if I have to spell it out to you. It's one of the reasons when people talk about God as just a kindly old fellow who pats you on the head and says, "That's nice," I know that isn't God for me. It never could be growing up in a family with a father like that. Never could be. When I read Rudolph Otto and he says that in the face of God you tremble a little bit, I know what he's talking about. See, I have a feel for that. I also have a feel out of that experience for the other side of it. Care, the forgiveness, all over, just like that. No grudges. I knew that from that moment on that was all forgotten. He wouldn't throw it up to me later on. It's all over, just like that. The outburst came, whoop, that's all. And I felt good about that. I didn't have to worry. Didn't have to worry about retribution later on. Oh, that tells me a lot about how I see God. Fresh start. What do I always tell people? It comes easily to my lips. God gives us a fresh start. I'm at ease with that. I feel right in sync. And I tell people God doesn't hold a grudge. God doesn't hold it against us. God gives us a fresh start, allows us to begin again. That is so real to me, so clear. Why? It's obvious. It's in my gut, or it's in my bones, just because of that kind of experience multiplied so many times over of what I just told you. It's interesting. Go to an encounter, a significant experience like that, and see what you can find out about yourself that way. Your own image of God. Be very revealing, I think. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be correctives. You know, that's why I think there's ways of, if one's image is out of sync with what it says in the Scriptures, then you're in trouble. Then we need to do something new. Try to change it in some way. Try to get in touch with a little healthier kind of image of God. Well, I think I will stop there. Why don't we take a minute or two of silence? And hope is by taking a couple minutes in here to do that. Got it. By taking a couple minutes in here to do that, that it will prime the pump and that he will carry it on elsewhere and afterwards and so on. That's a lot of how I envision this course is to promote that kind of reflection discussion. Let's see if we have questions around that whole topic of the image of God, the problem of getting fixated at a certain level of having negative imagery of God, poor self-image, and so on. Yeah. I think that's important, as a matter of fact. I think communities and persons, identifying and be close to, or? Yeah. I see what you mean. I think not, but I'm going to springboard to this point, because I think it's worth trying to say more about that kind of thing. I would say, in direct answer, that I think is a little risky. What the person needs is not one person who epitomizes all these things, but God-like qualities in a way, but a person who will be close and allow you to be and to trust your experience and encourage you to get in touch with what is good inside of you. I think that's the kind of person that would be most helpful here. The person, that's right, who will facilitate that and who would encourage you and free you to look at your own experience, to trust your own, the good sides of it, who would give you positive feedback about who you are who would, and honest feedback so that you could trust it. In other words, that's a big part of our religious problem, isn't it? We got all kinds of people walking around with poor images of God. And we have to find our ways to overcome that. Having an individual who really care and see the good in you and try to bring that out seems to be a really important thing. But it's also important to have a community. You know, I think it's vital for people like that to get to good liturgy. You know, you want to talk about, shopping around for liturgies. There's a great reason for doing it. I mean, I would say it's crucial to do it. I mean, the idea of going in a geographical area is far less important than maintaining your sanity or getting things together or improving your whole emotional life. I'd say people like that shouldn't be at negative liturgies with negative imagery of floating around. If they sense that, they probably ought to get out. They'd be better off not to go to Mass that day, if that's what's going on, because that will just resurrect the whole business, all the negative feelings about God, reinforce it. So I would say not only the individual, but community, small groups. I think we found that very often it is in the small group that good things like this happen, because where people are there sharing, I think the renewed group, sometimes that happens that way. And our other peer ministry kind of groupings where people with similar problems or divorced people get together and talk and so on. That seems to be good in some way because it lets one know that one's negative feelings are not, you're not the only one having them. That it's somehow all right to have those. I believe that a crucial part of this, is to deal with the very anger that one may well feel at God. Because that's a very likely outcome of this, the negative imagery, is that one just eventually gets mad at God and angry that it's all so messed up, so unfair, and so on. And therefore, one has to learn what to do with that anger. And one of the important things to do with that anger is to model it on human encounters. That is, to be able to say what I was saying in answer to the gentleman before. That is that if you can find somebody else that you can go up to and say, I'm angry at you, and they deal with it all right, and it works out, then you can say in your mind, well, God's like that person, only better. Therefore, I'm not afraid to tell that person I'm angry at them, and they seem to still like me or accept me, and I'm still okay with them. Then God's even bigger and better than that in terms of love and care. Therefore, I can trust to talk to God about my anger over this unfair situation. I think that's crucial in moving forward. I mean, you could never get any place with this if you had to repress that kind of anger. You can't get it. Because that'll always block the movement to achieving a better image of God. You're always stalemated because God's always one then that you're either angry at or you're afraid to say or admit you're angry at. You're always in a catch-22. There's no way out. And it seems to me the only way out is by interacting with a human being who will allow you to be angry and not get bent out of shape over it and allow you to express your emotions and still care about it. Then, if that works right, then that ought to extrapolate to the relationship with God. Then one ought to be able to take the next step and say, well, this person can handle my anger. Why can't God handle it? He loves me even more. I think it has to go something like that. So a number of steps, and that's absolutely crucial to know that. That's why relationships are the essence of it. You have to have people around you that build you up and allow you to.
what the warning is about how close it is. Not what we do with all the negative parts about it.
Yeah.
I think most recently, one Sunday about that, working off the
Now, this is my general approach to that is to say that any particular text in the Bible has to be interpreted in the light of the whole of the Bible. That's the great rule of interpretation. So if one reads the text that you get thrown out, or there'll be wailing and gnashing of teeth and so on, and you end up thinking that God is an ogre, then you got to match that against the whole ethos of the Bible, the whole spirit, the whole direction. And my own reading of that would suggest that you would be off base. That the overall thrust of the Bible is a God who cares, who loves us, who's on our side, who fights against evil, and will bring the good to final victory. That God is not to be tampered with in the Bible. There's no doubt about that. That God expects response. I don't think you can get around that. And that's why I go back to Rudolph Otto's examination of all genuine religious experience. He claims there's always two things in it. I'm preempting now. I got a whole class on religious experience. What am I doing? Well, he says there's two things. I'll tell you another time. So there's always an awesomeness about it. Always awesome. Can't get away from it. Therefore, you have to match the way you read the verse up against what the overall message of the Bible is. Now, once you see that, then you have to perhaps reinterpret the verse. You know, what did that mean in that particular passage? So if the parable of the virgins that are coming up, the foolish and the wise, it appears to me, at least, that the real meaning of it is that we're supposed to be on alert. Not that foolish virgins get punished. The message is that we are to be alert. The message of God. So that's an intellectual reinterpretation that the homilist can do, or that anybody can do who listens to the passage. But then you have a further problem, and that is the emotional reaction to it. People have emotional reaction to Scripture passages that might not seem appropriate to others. However, those are real, and one has to be able to deal with that. Now, if one goes into church and it hits one that way, my theory of it would be, one, try to just move around it. Concentrate on a positive passage. I don't see any sense in sitting there being in anguish for 52 minutes and then, getting up and leaving and bitching at one's wife. It doesn't make sense. I would say that one ought to move beyond it, move around it, concentrate on the other positive parts of the Mass. I think that's what we should do generally when homilies are poor, for example. I mean, doesn't mean that we just have to sit there and feel terrible. There's other things to do, to blank that out and to work on something positive that was being in the Scriptures themselves. So I think there's ways of dealing with the negative emotional responses that come. Say a person is in trouble that way, they probably ought to go home and do 15 minutes positive meditation, positive imagining, as I described it before, to counterbalance that, instead of walking around all day depressed. One of the things that stands behind that, of course, is the great power of religious symbols to touch us. A lot of people in the secular world don't understand that. And they think religion is just there, And even a lot of churchgoers don't understand the power of the religious symbols to really integrate, to heal, as well as to repress and to hurt. We have to be careful that their function positively for us. almost have the feeling you can consciously decide to do that. And the reason I say that is most people, when I find out that they've been healed in some way, or they've moved from a negative self-image to a positive one, and I ask them how they did that, very often the answer is, oh, I don't know, but it's like I just decided to do it. Now, I don't know exactly what to make of that, but I know that's the answer I get from people very often who've made progress. I just decided to quit feeling sorry for myself. I just decided to quit thinking of myself in bad terms. Not worth it. Why should I? I was just hurting myself. I remember a seminarian student of mine telling me in a graphic way, he just hated his parents. He just, after every class, he'd come up to me and tell me how crummy they were, how they messed up his life and everything. And one day he was all changed. They came up and his face looked at me. I said, well, what? How you doing? Great. He said, great. You know, I said, what? Oh, yeah. And he just, that's what he told me. He said, I just decided I was hurting myself more than them. Why should I? So I quit hating. Now, you know, people can say that's not possible or whatever, and maybe there's a process that has to go on, but I'm just saying I've seen it over and over. And it's almost like the person who says there's 10 bad things about me and one good thing. They just decide to look here. I don't know how they do it, but that's what happens. They begin to look at the one good thing and block out the 10 bad that they think are there. And that's one of the reasons people often ask me, you think people can change? I know people can change, because I've seen it. I've seen cases like that where you wouldn't believe they could. And it's, you know, ultimately from our faith perspective, we say that's the grace of the Spirit. You know, that's God's work. That's, you don't accomplish that without the workings of the Spirit. But on the other hand, when you look at the psychological dynamics of it, that's what people will often say. I just decided to quit punishing myself and to get on with life. It's crucial, you know, obviously crucial. I think that what children pick up is, first of all, from in their family setting with them. And they don't pick up what the words are. They pick up the underlying message that's coming across. If they're loved and cared for, if that's there, that seems to be true. Now, people heard Vince Dwyer talk right in this room, and Vince was very convinced that you had to say it also. Now, that is his personal experience, I know, and I don't dispute that at all. But, to me, the far more primary thing is that people actually do love their children and care for them. In some cases, it appears as though the words are crucial and necessary, in other cases not. I mean, I know people who are convinced that their parents love them, and their parents very seldom ever said that. I just know you don't have to have heard it over and over. Anyway, you know, Abraham Maslow's study of mature people, that mature people do not have to hear over and over that they're loved. You know, the fully actualized people that he studied, he said those people, I mean, they need strokes now and then, but they don't need them all the time. They don't need to hear just over and over their love. They know they're loved. And it's nice to hear it now and then, but they don't fall apart if they don't. They function well without it. So I'm presenting two messages here. I mean, to be fair to Vince Dwyer, I know that when he says that, and I watch 450 people in here on the edge of their chairs at his benches while he says it, and I know that there's a great need to hear it. And I'm not denying that at all. Of course, the words, apart from the actual love, would mean perfect little. So I'd say to maximize the situation, what parents ought to be doing, being honest, straightforward with their kids, loving them, and being able to express out loud in words, gesture, hugging, holding, touching, saying the positive things to their young ones. That seems to be important. The other thing that I would do if they were my kids is I would know what kind of religious classes they're in and what kind of mood and message is coming across. When my kid is in a class that's getting repressive, heavy messages, it wouldn't be interesting. That's what would be crucial. Oh, that can't happen. And it goes on, you know that. That hurts. And if it reinforces negative stuff from the family, then you got a real mess. Now, if you're giving good positive messages and images and things are going badly in the religious classroom or in the school, well, you know, maybe it'll turn out all right anyway. I don't see. But we should be trying to have the positive images in the classroom and people ought to be trying to make sure that happens. The next thing is in the church as a whole. That's why people should pick very carefully who they go to confession with. St. Teresa, all the spiritual masters said, pick your confessor carefully. You don't want to end up in a situation where you're going to get yelled at in confession. And that's happened. We all know that. And some people hardly ever get over that in their life. They just always remember that. And it's bad, and it happens. Therefore, it's smart to go to somebody where you know it isn't. Another thing, I'd say too, you want to get the kids into positive liturgical situations. That seems crucial too. So I think that's one of the great legacies we do. That not many things more important that we hand on. So that it is that the gospel is precisely that. It's good news. It's good news. The good news is that we are loved despite our unworthiness, despite our sin. It's like my short creed for kindergarten. The one who loves you even if you do bad things. And that's what we mean by the Word of God. They want to get a little feel for first graders and what you mean by God. That's it. There's one who loves you even if you do a bad thing. One who still loves you. That's what we want to get across. And put the negative in it, because that's good of everything. It says we never want to use the threat of hell, mortal sin, damnation, or punishing God to keep kids in line. Going to hell for that. I mean, obviously, that would be a lot of mistake in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. The point is made that we would need good classes to help parents to know how to do their job well. You know, and everybody sees that. I mean, first grade teachers tell me already, they get them in the first grade, some of them got problems already that maybe they could almost never catch up, it seems like. You know, where the real problem is back here with, you know, how the parents have been treated. That's what we say about theology classes for adults. If we can get across positive notions of who God is to adults, then we'll make faster strides. In other words, you can, have people going around telling kids all the time God loves them, pay them money to do that and everything, but they're getting another signal at home. It's not going to do much good. So we've got to get, in terms of progress, obviously, to that level. Good classes, not only good classes for the parents, but good experiences for the parents, and understanding their responsibility to that. I think part 3 is like, whoop, down the drain. That's all right. Anything else that anyone wants to ask here? Yep, good.
I guess a little bit more of an abstract question, but I guess in thinking
I think that allows me to make the counterpoint, and which needs to be made to much of what I've said. That is, the whole creation of the image of God is obviously not just a private kind of matter that we end up doing and creating some sort of an illusion for ourselves, filtered through our own character and personality. That's a factor, but there's something else that goes on. And that is, there is a received notion of who God is. There is a tradition of what God is like. It exists in a lot of places. It exists in religion. Or it exists within Christianity. There's a whole understanding of who God is that is there in the Scriptures, highlighted by Jesus' calling God Abba. And there's a whole notion of God that comes through in the celebration of the Eucharist, of the community gathering, of baptism, etc. So that the sort of private turn that I took in my own presentation needs, and I'm very glad you brought that out, needs a communal context. And that is that we grow up in a world where there's already a notion of God. There's a cultural notion of God. There's a notion of God that exists in the parish that we grew up in our families and so on. And so that very image of God is also at work on us. It has to somehow interact with what's ever in my guts, whatever I intuit to be true about the world. Now, one of the things you'd like to do is to get those two things to match. One of the things that happens, of course, is as people get positive images of God growing out of their guts, their intuition of life, and they're feeling better about themselves,